This is Brother Peter Diamond here, and I'm checking in with an update on Father John Corapi, a popular Novus Ordo priest and preacher. And I want to quickly explain why Father Corapi is unfortunately a heretic, a phony, and a spiritual fraud. Corapi deceives many in the Vatican II Church because he speaks with a strong voice and he comes across as a person who really stands for the truth and speaks without compromise. Corapi speaks as if he's dedicated to the Catholic faith and as if he believes that Our Lady and the Eucharist and all of these things really matter. For example,
how else can you participate in the sin of another? By silence. Number 8. By silence. And we have had a deafening silence for too many years. And we go from bad to worse. And millions and tens of millions of babes snuffed out in their own mother's womb. And we're silent. And God gives the grace of authority to Catholics. And then they are silent in the face of gross moral evil.
Well, Corapi is the same person who said on EWTN that if a pro-abortion politician or public figure approached his, quote, communion rail, he wouldn't know what he would do. He doesn't know what would happen. In other words, he wouldn't necessarily refuse him communion. He's also in communion with those who are pro-abortion because he wouldn't say that pro-abortion public figures are non-Catholic excommunicated heretics because his very authorities, the, quote, cardinals and bishops in his church and his, quote, Pope, Benedict XVI, regards pro-abortion public figures as Catholics, as proven by the fact that they commemorated as the servant of Christ the pro-abortion, pro-gay marriage apostate, Ted Kennedy. So he can talk all day in a theatrical voice, but he won't even refuse a pro-abortion public figure communion. But that's just the beginning of this phony heretics nonsense. Corapi accepts ecumenism, okay? Anyone who accepts ecumenism rejects Christ. That means that you accept other religions as decent and as not evil, and that the people who are in them are not excluded from salvation. And he believes, in fact, one of us heard him say on EWTN, that rabbis have a mission. God bless them for it. Okay, so he's saying rabbis who reject Christ, who according to the infallible teaching of the Council of Florence, all who die outside the Catholic Church are not saved. All the Jews are not saved. They need to be converted to be saved. The rabbis don't have any mission from God. He's saying they have a mission, and God bless them for it, as if they're doing good. That is total apostasy, a total rejection of Christ. So he can speak all day in this loud voice about how he's without compromise and he stands for the truth. It's meaningless. He's a phony because he accepts those who completely reject Christ himself. And he believes that such individuals can be saved. He speaks of Protestants, okay, those who reject Our Lady, who reject the papacy, who reject Catholic dogmas. He speaks of them as our brothers. He says that there are many good churches, okay, one of us heard him say. He, of course, has to accept the official teaching of Vatican II that they may receive communion. That's in Orientalium Ecclesiarum number 27. It's also in the New Heretical Catechism of John Paul II. And if you want the truth for what's going on, see our website, vaticancatholic.com, for all the information about what a Catholic must conclude about the Vatican II Church. It must conclude that it's actually not the Catholic Church. The Church still exists, but it exists in a remnant of Catholics who hold fast to all the teachings of the popes. And Corapi is a modernist acceptor of Vatican II's ecumenism and the outrageous acts of apostasy of the Vatican II anti-popes. He obviously didn't condemn John Paul II for going into the synagogue and praying there, or Benedict XVI for doing that. All of these are acts of apostasy according to traditional Catholic teaching. And so he can talk all day about this or that. He doesn't believe in Catholic teaching or care about Catholic teaching. It's an act. And even his whole persona, you can see it's an act. It's overdone. He speaks with this booming voice. Does he really care about the truth? Is that really from his heart? No, it isn't, because it's in your actions. If you accept all this other stuff, it means nothing. Now, if you stand for the truth and want to speak in a loud, booming voice, that's fine. But if you don't stand for the truth, then it's phony. He believes that a Protestant minister who hates the Catholic Church can have salvation. He believes that an Eastern, quote, Orthodox patriarch who doesn't believe in the papacy, rejects it, and will never believe in it, can be saved and is in the church. He wouldn't condemn John Paul II for turning the Assisi monastery over to the leaders of false religion so that they could worship devils. Even if he disagreed with that, he wouldn't say that that was a mortal sin on John Paul II's part that excluded him from the church for apostasy, which is what Catholic teaching forces us to conclude. In fact, I called his secretary one time and asked her if the Catholic Church is necessary for salvation. And she responded, no. And I said, what's the point, therefore, in your view, of being Catholic? And she said, because it's the fullness of truth. And I said, well, it's not necessary, though. And she said, you're right. That is heresy. That is not Catholic teaching. The Church teaches that the faith is necessary, but he doesn't believe that. Some of the other heresies of Corapi, he talks about homosexuality, and he does condemn homosexual acts to a degree. He condemns them. But he says that homosexuality might be genetic, and we have the clip on that. He says that God might make people this way. He says that we don't know how it's caused.
It's Christian perfection. Many, many times I have spoken with homosexual persons. I've spoken with lesbians. And sometimes they just don't want to talk and they're angry. But I tell them, look, don't get mad at me. I'm not against you. I really love you. And I understand in some way. It may not be a perfect understanding, but you're like me in a certain way. You're called to perfect chastity because of the way that you find yourself. If that is a condition, and we don't know everything about that condition yet, whether or not there's a genetic factor, we don't know. But we know this: no one has to engage in gravely disordered activity.
No, God doesn't make people as homosexuals. Okay, Romans 1 is very clear that they're given over to these unnatural lusts through apostasy. So that means that these desires are not natural. They're not from God. People become that way through mortal sins of the flesh, through idolatry. And that's been seen in many cultures which are steeped in idolatry. They have a problem with homosexuality, and that's why we see it proliferating today. And so he basically blasphemes God by saying that God might create people this way. He also shows that he's a religious indifferentist because while he also condemns moral evils such as masturbation, he leaves the door open that some people could be committing this heinous mortal sin without mortal sin, through stress, etc. So he's not definitive that it's a mortal sin in every case. No, it is a mortal sin in every case. In fact, it's one of the sins mentioned in Ephesians 5, which excludes people from salvation. That's covered in one of our YouTube videos. But you can see it's always justifying people, leaving the door open for this or that. And when you deny the dogma outside the church, there is no salvation. When you have a heretical understanding of ignorance, as he does, when you are a modernist, you leave the door open for anything to be possibly justified. He does the same thing when he speaks against artificial contraception, and we have the clip on that, where he says that if you know it's a sin, it's a mortal sin.
I'm telling you that artificial contraception, in whatever form it takes, birth control pills, condoms, whatever it may be, that's intrinsically disordered. If you know it, now you do, and do it in the light of that knowledge, it's mortal sin. So don't do it.
No, that's not the teaching of the church. Pope Pius XI spoke infallibly in his encyclical Casta Connubii, said, any use whatsoever of matrimony exercised in such a way that the act is deliberately frustrated in its natural power to generate life is an offense against the law of God and of nature, and those who indulge in such are branded with the guilt of a grave sin. End quote. He doesn't say if they know it's a sin. No, they're guilty of the sin by the very fact that they're committing that act, because when they do that act, they know that it's contrary to the natural order of things. And so he leaves the door open and clearly indicates that people could be practicing artificial contraception without committing mortal sins, such as countless Protestants, liberals, etc. And that's heresy. That is contrary to Catholic teaching. It's in conformity with heretical Vatican II modernism, of course, which leaves the door open for anyone to have salvation doing anything.